It's my real pleasure to welcome Assal Habibi this morning. I feel like this program wouldn't have been complete without her being here, so we're very happy that she's here. Assal is Associate Professor of Psychology at USC, University of Southern California, where she's the Director of the Center for Music, Brain, and Society, and has been a member of the Brain and Creativity Institute since 2011, I believe. She received her BA and PhD in psychology from UC Irvine, so a real California person. Her work focuses on the impact of music on health and development. She's combined longitudinal studies, cross-sectional studies, and now a randomized control study. And her work is really notable for its very creative and rigorous combination of methodologies, including EEG, imaging, behavior, and so forth. And I first met Assal in the early 2010s when we were both starting some longitudinal studies of music impact around the El Sistema program. So Assal was working with the Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles, YOLA. And following her progress over the years has been really wonderful. I feel like it's kind of like, to me, it's like reading a textbook in science, how science should be done, in the sense that she took these initial observations and identified promising effects, designed targeted interventions, and kind of built up this whole research system to the point now where she's doing the first randomized controlled trial in North America ever, really, of music as an intervention. Which is very exciting. This is kind of like the thing that many people thought was impossible. It's how do you solve the issues of equity when you're randomizing students to different interventions? And she solved that. So she has two, beautiful interventions that are both, beneficial potentially. There's lots of subtle issues in studying the impact of music, and I think we'll hear more about how she's solved those today. Really looking forward to it. And I guess really we'll probably hear a bit about executive function, which is one area where she's really focused on the impact of music. I'll just kind of add in closing that not only has she done science, but I think really single-handedly she's been bringing very high-quality artistic kind of training to hundreds, maybe thousands of children in LA through kind of a growing network of arts institutions, and really looking forward to hearing your talk today. So thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, John, for such a kind introduction. Yes, I joke and say if the science doesn't work out, a lot of kids learn to play music. So it will be a positive net effect. It's great to be here. Thank you, Laura, for the invitation, for all of you to be here this morning. I am looking forward to share our work at the Brain and Creativity Institute. So I grew up playing piano, and this question of how engagement with music interacts with both social and biological predisposition and how that interaction relates to neurocognitive development has been really the question on my mind since I started my PhD work. So over the past really 10 to 12 years, been trying to build studies to answer this question. So today, I'm going to share with you results from our longitudinal work. This was the work that John mentioned with Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles. I'm going to scaffold it with some cross-sectional results. I'm going to talk a little bit about our ongoing RCT and recent data, results from ABCD data, which is kind of a large data set, and kind of looking at that from a perspective of what applies to the general population. As I'm going through this, I just kind of put this slide to kind of bring our attention to, I'm going to be talking both about what we know as near transfer effects, meaning that skills that as a result of music training changed, but they're sound-related skills. Auditory perception, musical skills, pitch perception, and I listed those and the related brain regions, but also far transfer effects, things that not necessarily are practiced in a music training program, like inhibition or executive function. It's not the goal of music learning to go and learn these skills, but we do have some results that show that music training has a relationship with advancing some of these skills. So the first study is the study that in 2012, when I started at USC, we talked about wanting to find a way to be able to systematically follow children as they learn music and understand the impact of music training on their development, both from a social and cognitive perspective, but also the underlying brain correlates. So this is the work we did with YOLA. This is the Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles. It's the education arm of the LA Philharmonic. It was brought to LA by Gustavo Dudamel, who's still the music director of the LA Phil, and it's an El Sistema-based program. Gustavo grew up in this program in Venezuela, and he wanted to bring this to LA, meaning that the program serves underserved children, so only really children who live in neighborhoods that don't have access to music education as part of their public school. Neither they have kind of means and resources to have private lessons. These children are enrolled in the program by a lottery, so kind of the requirement is that they have to live about 2 miles radius of the program, and they start at age 6. Everything in the program is done in a group, so there's a lot of emphasis on group interaction. There's no private lesson, and they all start with string instruments, violin and viola. They go 4 to 5 times a week, about 2 hours a day. So it's pretty intense. It's all after school. I mean, it's a lot of programming, but if you've also seen 26-year-olds with violins, not 2 hours is playing violin. It's a lot of chaos at the beginning. But I think one of the success of the program, YOLA started with 80 students in LA, and now they serve about 1,000 students, is the fact that it creates a community. These kids call this place home. It's a lot of, at the beginning when you ask them why you go to the program, it's about friendship, and I belong here, and I have a voice. And they give them a lot of recognition. They, after 2-3 years of training, they opened the Hollywood Bowl, not because they were musically good enough to open the Hollywood Bowl, but there's a lot of like, you matter and that your music matter. And I think, again, that's, again, the reason of their success. And for us, being lucky to be benefiting from the retention of these students in the program. Because we were going to follow these kids longitudinally, every child gets better with language and memory and cognition and social skills over time, so we wanted to have control groups. We identified a sports program to control for the group aspect of music training. So this was a very similar program as a community soccer program, met about the same amount of time and frequency and quality, similar neighborhoods, similar socioeconomic status. And then we also had a passive control group. These were children that at the time that we enrolled them in the study were not part of any systematic music or sports program. Well, we did not tell them that for the next 5 years you cannot touch a soccer ball or play piano. This would not have been ethical, but we stayed in a pretty constant communication and interviewed their parents about every 3 months or so. And if they picked up an enrichment program that reached the same frequency and quality of our interventions, we did not include them in our analysis. We had 25 students per group, and in order to, I mean, this is not a randomized control trial, but we wanted to at least provide an equal baseline, knowing that they're all starting at the same place. So we tested everybody on all of our measures, including our brain measures at baseline, and showed that at least from a statistical perspective, there were no significant group differences in any of the metrics. And again, that doesn't solve issues of motivation and predisposition and parents' environment, but at least in the metrics that we were interested in, they were starting at an equal baseline. And then from then, they came to our laboratory once a year. They spent a lot of time there. They practically come at like 10 a.m. and stay until 4 or 5 p.m. We have a very comprehensive battery of psychometric testing. They also did MRI every other year, so baseline year 2, year 4, and then EEG every year. And then from there, we're looking at development of these skills, both social and cognitive skills, and the underlying neural correlates. I wanted to share like the data that we have. This is everybody and all kind of different types of data that we have. The musical, these are kind of the sanity check that are they learning music, is there pitch perception and beat perception, and production is getting better. A series of executive function, this is NIH toolbox, and looking at their cognitive skills, social emotional development, and again, very extensive interviews with their parents. The scanning procedure was inhibition control really focused in the fMRI, and then we have structural MRI and diffusion weighted imaging, and then EEG that they did that I will go through the methods. We had a really pretty strong retention for both this age and also the population. This is a pretty transient population. The parents take on new jobs, they move, but they did stick to the program. It was originally planned for 5 years. We got an extension grant to be able to have data for 2 years after that. At this point, I mean, you can see that our retention is pretty good up to this point. This is a little bit beginning of COVID, and also at this point, they were adolescents and had a lot of agency of what they wanted to do and whether they want to come. It was not their parents can tell them what to do. I also wanted to share this because we have published maybe about 20 or so papers from this, but it's a lot of data. So if anybody is interested in any part of this data, you want to relate neuroimaging to any behavioral metrics, we are very happy to share. I think there is a lot in there that we still haven't even looked at. Okay, so starting with musical skills. We took this idea from Haley's paper a couple of years ago to look at the musical skills over time, use the PCA to put everything that has what we call music aptitude, such as pitch perception and rhythm perception, across the years together and show that, yes, over time, they are learning music, and these musical aptitude skills are getting better, as well as what we call their music production skills, which is singing and entrainment, things that are kind of like they learn how to do and they can perform. And you can see that, again, music groups starting better. This is probably something about kids who sign up for music or parents who are interested to sign their children for music, have an interest, maybe more rich musical environment at home. But again, there is a group by time interaction that they continue to improve. So that was good. They're learning music. These skills are getting better. Looking at just kind of broader auditory perception, this is a paradigm that Tony Shaheen did, I think in 2006 or 7, maybe with Laurel. Yeah, and they are listening to these passive sounds. They could be music or white noise, and the music was either their instrument, violin or piano, and we're just collecting EEG over time from them. They're watching a movie, a silent movie while we're doing that. And the finding real is that as children grow up in the auditory perception, there is this kind of complex of P1 and 100, that P1 amplitude tends to get reduced and N1 gets larger. And what we see in the music group, this is their baseline, that there were no differences, but as 2 years after music training, we saw the appearance of N1 and larger N1 amplitude compared to the other groups, which is kind of more adult-like. They're like arriving at this maturation state. This is a topography of N1. I'm sure everybody is familiar looking at EEG plots. This is the top of the head. And we kind of see this appearance of N1 in the music group earlier in time, and it gets stronger, again, larger enhanced amplitude. And our interpretation of this was that it seems that their N100 response is more like an adult, even though they're matched in age and all the other cognitive and socioeconomic measures. Then looking at a little bit more complex task. We wanted to know how their auditory, especially for musical information, auditory perception works. So we provided them with these melodies while we were collecting EEG data. The melodies, this is, again, probably a familiar task to many of you. They're kind of simple notes. And sometimes the two parts are identical, and sometimes the second part of the melody has a note that is deviant. This deviation could be a pitch deviation or a rhythmic deviation. Behaviorally, when the two melodies were identical, everybody did very well, about like 90%. So it's not a question that they cannot hear. The control kids can hear as well. However, when we had deviation, this is music on the left and control on the right. We only did this task starting at year 3, so I don't have baseline data. But after 2 years of music training, they're doing this task significantly better than control group, so they can detect these deviation of pitch. And it's accompanied by the presence of this P300 response, which is index of attention, probably indexing the anterior cingulate. Again, this is the topography of P300. You can see that it's stronger and more localized as they get older, and we don't see that in the control group. So they're not doing as well, and they don't have the accompanying brain network. The sports group kind of falls in the middle. And as we get, for musical skills, the music group is always different from sports and control. As we get kind of further away, auditory, language, cognitive function, the sports group always kind of falls in the middle, and the most significant differences that we have is between music and control. So there is something about being part of some activity that is engaging and motivating and rewarding that has some of these cognitive and social benefits that we also see in music. Looking at the structure of the brain, we are very interested in kind of morphological changes in the brain, especially the auditory cortex, primary auditory cortex and secondary auditory areas on the left and the right. And we published these results showing that for the music group, after 2 years of training, we have less cortical thinning over time on the right side in the superior temporal gyrus compared to the left side. Now, everybody has cortical thinning as part of development. That's a kind of course of cortical development, but specifically in this area, and then we kind of matched it with every other area of the brain, and the specific superior temporal gyrus, we've seen this slowdown of the cortical thinning. A very similar phenomenon happens when children learn language on the left side. So at the onset of language learning, you see reduction of cortical thinning on the superior temporal gyrus. On the left side, we wanted to make sure that these results are correct and make sense. So we brought in a completely different group of children cross-sectionally. These were children who were conservatory trained, had 2 years of music training, private, different socioeconomic status, and a separate control group. And what we saw is that, again, for the children in the music group, we see thicker cortex on the right in this specific superior temporal gyrus area. So kind of it matches that they have, longitudinally there is less thinning, which kind of results in more cortex on the right side. And that also predicted their performance ability. So we took these videos as they perform, and we have judges who rate them. And the thicker the cortex in the specific area, the better quality of performance they had. We have been kind of looking at this data over time now, all the way till age 10. This is work that Kevin Jamie, who's recently joined my lab as a postdoc, has been working on. And a very similar pattern in the primary and secondary auditory area, especially in the primary auditory cortex on the right side. We see less thinning over time, all the way through age 10. Also in the motor cortex, in the motor areas, in the inferior frontal gyrus, both in the pars opercularis and triangularis. Pars opercularis is really the posterior part of the inferior frontal gyrus, closest to the motor cortex. We are still trying to make sense of this. And if you have, I think there is something about these areas, this auditory motor coordination and these specific regions being important for music production, that has something to do with the neuroplastic changes that we see in the cortical matter. This is also the pathway of the arcuate fasciculus, the white matter that facilitates auditory motor coordination. But it's very interesting that we continue seeing this over time as they continue to learn music. I mean, the general pattern of thinning exists for everybody, and these are corrected for baseline and corrected for age and corrected for the general cortical thickness of the brain. Okay, so a little bit more on kind of the anatomical changes. We are also, as I said, we had diffusion imaging, and we looked at the connectivity of sensory and motor regions through the corpus callosum. So you're looking at the callosum fibers connecting the left to the right. And at baseline, there were no differences between group in terms of fractional anisotropy, robustness of the kind of these fiber connectivity. And what we saw is that after 2 years of music, the children in the music group had more higher FA in the areas connecting the motor areas and sensory areas, which is expected. Like, they're playing music, they're coordinating hands and motor and, again, sensory regions. More interesting was more connectivity in the frontal lobe. So higher FA connecting the superior frontal gyrus, left and to the right. We are again looking at this data for year 5 and see if we continue to see these patterns of connectivity in addition to looking at the arcuate that connects the auditory and motor regions. Okay, so what about their social skills? This is a very social music training program. We did not see any kind of improvement that was specific to the music group. This is the empathy index, and this is the eyes mind kind of perspective taking. I'm not a big fan of this empathy index because I think it relies heavily on language development. You have to read these sentences, and sometimes the second part of the sentence relies on the first understanding of the first part, and they just basically say yes or no to whether they feel they agree with that. We did see some improvements specifically compared to the sports group in their emotion matching. So these are, we try to create empathy response, kind of like state empathy. We showed them these video clips. There is always a character in the video clip that is experiencing an emotional experience, like a little girl who has lost their friend and they're crying, and then we ask the children to name the emotion of the character, and also in order for us to understand their empathic response, we ask, how do you feel? And then we match the two. This is just the matching of the emotion, and these movies get more complex and age appropriate as they get older, but they do better in this task compared to the sports group. None of these measures correlated with this rhythmic entrainment, with their rhythmic entrainment and synchronization. So we don't see that relationship of more better rhythm synchronization and prosocial behavior. Another thing I think it's important to say about this population, and I think something that I've been thinking about, so these children were primarily from immigrant families and Latino population. They do a lot of sharing as part of their life. They tend to live together as kind of larger family units, multi-generation, and sharing and giving and helping is part of their everyday life. It's not like something extra that they need to do, and this is true for the sports group and the control group as well. So I think kind of keeping that in mind as we are looking at the development of prosocial skills for a specific group that we have kind of large data from, versus when we look at people from different cultures and how their prosociality is related to the culture that they're coming from is important. As I said, we do interviews with their parents. This is a lot of this work was done by my colleague Beatrice Ilari. And over time, we see the parents of the children in the music group rated them better in some of these mental health metrics of aggression and hyperactivity. Again, these are parents who are committed. They show up 3 times a week. The sports parents also do the same. They do show up as frequently, and they sign up their child to an enrichment program. We don't see that pattern. In fact, in the aggression score, they think that their children are more aggressive over time. the kind of the sad part for me is the children in the control group, children who do not have access to any enrichment program, and even from the perspective of their own family members, they are doing worse in hyperactivity and aggression. Okay, so moving to the executive function, things that such as delayed gratification and response inhibition. These are very important skills in terms of development, but also academic achievement and life success. We looked at this inhibition both in terms of delayed gratification, so you're grabbing a cookie during lunch, or you wait and have a healthier meal for a better lifestyle, and also response inhibition, looking at the underlying brain correlates of that. In terms of delayed gratification, what we did is we did a delayed discount task. So you change basically the future reward. So a small condition is that you can have an M&M now. And as I'm sure many of you know, sugar is a very successful and effective method of testing delayed gratification for children and adults. So 1 versus 2 would be a small. 1 versus 4, like you can have an M&M now versus 4 later, would be a medium. And then 1 versus 8. So there's a huge difference between the amount, the number of M&Ms they could have in the future. And what I'm showing you is this is a music group. And when there is 1 versus 2, in a small reward, sometimes they wait for it 50% of the time they wait for it, and 50% of the time they wanted to have the reward immediately. The interesting thing for us is that when it's 1 versus 8, so this large, 100% of the time they wait for it. We don't see that same kind of modulation of behavior in the control group, depending, like, they do not change their behavior depending on the size of the future reward. And I think part of this is coming from being a musician, learning how to play, kind of like measure by measure, having to practice more, having to go back to something. Again, you can see that the significant difference is between the music and control, and the sports kids fall in the middle. Being in something that is motivating and engaging and rewarding probably have the same effects if it's not music. Doing this inside the MRI, we didn't do M&Ms, we did a kind of a color word Stroop task. Again, you're probably familiar with this. You have to name the color of the word, so you have to inhibit yourself. These are kind of words that are flashed on the screen, and you have to name the color of the word as fast as possible, and often inhibit yourself from reading the word. And we are comparing like congruent trials where the color and the word are the same versus incongruent trials where the color of the word doesn't match the text. And what we saw is that when we compare the music to the control children, we saw more engagement of these executive network of the brain while they're doing this incongruent versus congruent contrast. This is inferior frontal gyrus, anterior insula, the pre-SMA, and anterior cingulate. So this makes sense. This is when you do an inhibition task successfully, this is a network of the brain that gets engaged. And we see that behaviorally they do better, and it seems that their neurocorrelates underlying is changing to support their better performance. So this is what I just showed you. This is 2 years after music training at the differences between music and control. We did this task again 4 years later, and the differences go away. The control kids eventually reach this performance level. Everybody is able to do this task. And the question for us is really, if you reach this milestone earlier in life, if you are better at inhibition when you're walking into middle school versus when you're in 9th grade. And does that make differences in terms of the trajectory of your development, decision making, and also maybe some protection mechanisms against ADHD, dyslexia, or other things that children kind of are challenged with. We did this made us to look at our data over time, and my student Sarah Hennessy kind of put everything together that we have in terms of working memory and inhibition. From all of the longitudinal data set that we had and cross-sectional, and what we've seen is that both for working memory and inhibition, there is a music by age interaction, music training by age interaction. However, it has a breakpoint at about age 10. So we see this interaction present between age 6 to 10, and then it kind of goes away a little bit. There's a flattening of these lines after age 10. I've been looking a lot at kind of sensitive periods of music training, the work by Virginia Penhoon, and it seems that not only there is, at least from our data, that there is not only a sensitive period for learning musical skills, but also the transfer effect of these musical skills to cognitive abilities and executive function. And at least in the United States, we are doing things completely in reverse because we don't have music program in our elementary schools. We have music programs in high school. So it just seems that if we put resources at a time that actually makes a difference, we would see better results. We are writing this up. It should come out in a few months. Okay. So everything I told you about this group of children, as I said, they, not by design, but they were primarily from Latino communities because that's the population that the program serves, and they live in the neighborhoods that the program serves. One caveat was that 86% of them were bilingual. So, and bilingualism is already being shown to be related with development of executive function skills and cognitive and language development. So we wanted to see whether it was music or it was knowing two languages pretty fluently. So we did a cross-sectional study looking at a group of children who were monolingual English speakers, which is very difficult to find in Los Angeles. The recruitment for this study took a very long time. I'm sure it's the same case in Canada. And then compare them to children who had music training, who did not have music training, were also bilingual, a little bit of a kind of a more broader age 8 to 12. And they did two tasks, a visual go, no-go task. These were done during EEG. So this is, you have to press a button when you see a purple triangle, and then the rule is different when you see, I don't know, a white square, you have to stop yourself from pressing a button. So it's a classic go, no-go task. Typically it's done with letters, but for children we did it with shapes, so to make it easier. And then they also did an auditory oddball task where they listen to tones that every once in a while there is a tone that doesn't match. It's 1,000 hertz versus 500 hertz. And then there's also this kind of white noise, distractor sound that comes in, and they have to press a button every time they hear the oddball. So let me show you behavioral results. Reaction time, children in the music who had music training do better, faster, about 30 milliseconds or so. And that actually does reach significant level. In terms of D prime and their performance on the task, they do better, but once we correct for socioeconomic status, that goes away. So there is something about, again, growing up in an environment that you're more cognitively stimulated that probably helps with performance in this task. We looked at visual potentials to see in terms of like sensory encoding and also kind of attention in a go, no-go task, whether there are differences. And stimulus-related ERPs, we didn't find any differences. But when we looked at their response-locked ERPs, so this is when they responding to a go versus no-go, I mean, they're pressing the button, we see that they have a larger kind of error-related positivity compared to the control kids. So when they make a mistake, they are aware that they make a mistake. And if any of you is a musician, you know that the second you know there's something wrong, there is an awareness around it. And again, topography of this error-related positivity, which is enhanced amplitude here. And then we also showed that especially in the music group and in the central electrodes, it predicts their D prime performance on the task. On the auditory oddball, again, there were no differences that reached significant level. They do better in their percent correct, like their performance of percent correct of detecting the oddballs. But once we correct for socioeconomic status, again, these results go away. But looking at their event-related potentials, this is stimulus locked. And this is to the distractor, not the oddball. We didn't really see much difference in the standard and the oddball, but in the distractor, we see this kind of a larger N2P3 in the music group that we don't see in the control group. And that's been shown before in terms of responding to an oddball paradigm, and we see that that the children who have had music training are showing this potential that is larger and more enhanced. And again, we see both with the N2 and P3A response to the distractor that is correlated with their performance on the task. Okay, so the longitudinal work and the cross-sectional work, and then we have been looking at wanting to understand this better at a larger level population, and ABCD is a wonderful data set to work with, and credit to John for adding some music questions in the surveys that the parents do. This is self-report, so we have to kind of take it with a grain of salt in terms of what parents report, but we do know about what kind of practice they have at home. Is it private? Is it public? How many hours of practice they have, but it's also 10,000 children that you can see performance of, and then it has all these NIH toolbox questionnaires and surveys, which are executive function and inhibition, things that we are interested in terms of our studies. So we replicated the work that was done by the Vanderbilt group, Miriam Lenz and Raina Gordon, that at the baseline, the ones who had music training systematically do better on all these executive function and cognitive measures compared to the ones who parents don't report of them having music training. But what we did is that now we've looked at this over time. So 2 more points of ABCD data, so they get scanned and they get studied every year of their life. And this trend continues, and there is a group by time interaction that the children who continue to do music tend to continue doing better. However, there seems to be a difference in the socioeconomic status. So when we look at children from areas with low deprivation index, these are high SES children, it seems that the music and the control group kind of continue in a parallel way. The children with music training did start better and they continue doing better, but there is not an interaction with the control group. These are children from communities with high area deprivation index. These are children who, if they're not doing music, they probably do not have other enrichment program. And this is where we see an interaction of music training, that it seems that the ones who have access to music, there is this compensatory kind of a benefit to cognitive development that music training provides for them, that the children who do not have control group. And this is a picture of vocabulary language measures. We saw these more in language development metrics than cognitive and executive function. The trends are there also for inhibition, but this is the one that we saw the kind of the most significant effect. Okay, so talking about the RCT, as John said, for the longest time, I even said this is impossible to do, this is a lot of work, but we were very lucky that we got a NIH grant that allowed for this, of really kind of honing into understanding that if you randomly assign children to a program, first of all, whether they stick with it, the 6-year-olds, and whether we continue to see some of these advancement in the metrics of interest. So this is kind of the design of this grant. That was, we first did a cohort of feasibility just to convince NIH that we can recruit children and we can assign them to the programs and they continue to go. So in this phase 1, we had 40 students. They were 6-year-olds. We recruited them first. They came to USC. We did measures, everything from psychometric measures and functional MRI. And really, the 2 tasks they're doing is a go, no-go task and a delayed discount task, similar to what we had in our longitudinal study. And then after that, we tell half of them, you go to a music program, and the other half go to a theater program. And parents kind of like, sometimes they didn't like the idea, but again, these are children coming from programs that from communities that don't have access to a lot of programming. And to our surprise, and really to my surprise, their participation in, this is a 2-year, so they commit for 2 years. The music program is 2 days of group training plus 1 day of private training. And then the theater program is 3 days of group lessons. I had to have a lot of conversation with the theater group to make sure they don't have any music in their programming, which at the beginning they laughed at me, but it was like, well, you can do anything you want, improvisation, take turns, but no music, no background music, nobody's playing kind of piano piano on the side, no singing. So it's very controlled. We participate. We have research staff who go to the programs every week. We get attendance from the teachers we know what time every child showed up, even if they're like 15 minutes late, to really kind of find this dosage of like how much music training is enough. In our first cohort, out of the 40 students and the 20 who are in music, 19 of them stuck with the program for 2 years, and the theater, 17 of them. So this was a really very good retention and also metrics for us to be able to transition to the next phase. And there are parents, I mean, I know there is a mother who takes their child to the music program, and she takes her time off every week and use that as a time to take her child to the music program. So again, it's the question of, when you provide high quality programming to families who don't have access, it's not that they don't like to go, it's just making it accessible, making it in a way that the music program is done at Colburn Conservatory, is very high quality, but they made this place very welcoming for these families. They do participate. So last year, we recruited our second cohort. That's about 75 children. So to add the cohort to become above 100 to 110 students, we'll have obviously dropouts over time. And we are at the point of about 1 year post our second cohort. So they're currently actually coming to USC doing their 1 year post-training assessments. They don't have a scan during the 1 year. The scan is only first and second year. So a year from now, almost, we should be able to be done with our data collection. It's a clinical trial. We haven't touched the data. We have been pre-processing it. But hopefully we've done enough of preparation that once the data is done collecting, we can publish it. And I really hope that, I mean, it's really interesting for me to see in terms of retention and attendance, how successful the programming has been, and hoping that this would allow some of these questions to answer in relation to predisposition and home environment. And we, again, do a lot of interviews with the parents to better understand what happens in their home, and kind of the challenges of their environment. And then finally, there is a study that we also kind of started at the same time, because we were doing this music and theater separately. We also decided to see, what if we put music and theater together? This is a separate study. It is not a randomized controlled trial, but we talked with the Los Angeles Opera, and we were interested into what if you teach children how to put story and music together, and whether that helps, especially with some of these social emotional measures that we didn't see any kind of like improvements specifically to the music group in our longitudinal data. So these children are part of the Los Angeles Children Chorus. They go to choir training, and then every week, they also have teaching artists that go from the LA Opera to teach them about opera. And they teach them, they kind of take their collective story, they make an opera together over time, but they also learn what is an aria, who is the hero of the study. And they actually sing, I mean, it's pretty kind of a serious singing. They also are required to go to 5 performances at the LA Opera during the matinee sessions. They get to go behind the stage, see costume, and part of this for us is that when you introduce a child at an earlier age to a performing arts space, maybe that would help them to participate in performing arts later as an adult. You're not as intimidated, and their families get to go and participate in this as well. So this is, I think they saw Hansel and Gretel, and then they were practicing that. It's a really fun program. Every time I go there, it's like, I wish I could do this. We currently have 30 participants in this, and then we are comparing them to a kind of a control group of participants who are doing a combination of enrichment programs as part of their after school. These are not necessarily low socioeconomic status. They're from across the board, and we are looking at similar metrics that we are doing in the RCT, but also added some of these perspective taking, empathy, and social behavior here to see if combining these two forms of art would benefit these abilities more significantly. Okay, so I'm going to just close with some thought that I think from the longitudinal work, we have evidence of benefits of music training to cognitive and executive function skills. These are more true when you look at auditory domain and associated brain areas that process sound and kind of sound and auditory and motor integration. This relationship between music training and especially executive functions, inhibition, and working memory tends to be more pronounced and significant before age 10. Again, we are trying to make sense of what that means. Is there a sensitive period around this? Does it help with arriving at this maturation milestone earlier in time? It also could be, I was talking with Adele Diamond about this, and she had a really interesting idea that maybe the executive function tasks are not difficult enough anymore. So they could be that you combine working memory and cognitive flexibility in a task, and that will be sensitive enough to still show differences between kids who had music training versus not. But also, again, if you have better working memory and better inhibition earlier in life, that may give you advantages in terms of development and academic achievement. And then we are hoping that our randomized control trial and then working with these larger data models can provide some more evidence in supporting these findings. And with that, I want to acknowledge and thank my students. They do all the hard work. I get to come and talk about it, and collaborators and funding partners who continue to fund this work. And thank you for all of your attention.
Thank you so much for that great talk, Assal. We have lots of time for questions.
Yeah.
So we have some question runners. I'll let you pick the people. And
Sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I think you have a microphone coming.
Thank you so much for an amazing presentation. And you can tell by my accent that I'm Hispanic, right? Living in North America and pretending to be bilingual. So talking about the children that participated in the study, right? We're talking about children that come from low-income families, probably immigrant families as well, and that bilingualism is forced on them. So, as usually happens with children that are part of bilingual, immigrant families. So, beyond being bilingual or monolingual, what other cultural nuances affected the results of the study?
I mean, in the longitudinal cohort, I know that, so these children have signed up for a music program. These are parents who were motivated and interested and found, even though they're very busy, a lot of them have multiple jobs during the day, but they found a program that they go to. They're motivated. Some of the parents may be musicians. Some may practice music at home. So there is a lot of that home environment that we really had no way of controlling for. And we recruited them in the study after they have enrolled for the program, before they started training, but after they have. So I think that plays a huge role. In the cross-sectional work, we really just controlled for language ability, so children who were monolingual and they couldn't speak English, Spanish, or any other language. I think with the RCT, we haven't excluded children who are bilingual, so we are allowing for that, but we have enough number of participants that probably we can use a covariate to control for that. But this question of home environment and motivation and predisposition is really, I think that's the only way to answer that through the clinical trial.
Just a second question, I'll give you back the microphone. It's, you're using the YOLA program from California, from LA. What about other programs around the same state? We have the San Diego Youth Symphony, the Community Opus project. In San Francisco, there are some other similar programs to Sistema.
Yeah.
And also Oakland, Sounds Mind. So are you planning to extend the research to them?
I mean, that would be really nice if I had the funding and kind of the bandwidth. I think all of these programs, I mean, John has been involved with the San Diego Youth Program, which is very similar in terms of what they offer to the students. I also do think there is an advantage to these multi-site studies. I've been lucky enough to be on part of now 2 multi-site studies. One is Sing Well, and then the other one is the one that we did with the group in Italy, Massimo Grassi, of looking at working memory in adult musicians and non-musicians. And our part was easy. We had 30 participants, but overall there's 1,200 participants in this study. And really doing a multi-site allows for looking at different programs and controlling for all these variables. So I think that's another way to do it. It's finding a funding mechanism that would support that. You're welcome. Haley.
Thanks for your great talk, Assal, and thank you for taking on the really challenging work of this RCT. That's very intimidating and ambitious, but I'm excited to find out what you learned. You had mentioned that maybe reaching milestones earlier might help in ways that you haven't measured yet. Can you speak a little bit to your line of thought on that? What would you like to measure that might inform that question? I thought that was a really interesting idea.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question and something that I've been thinking about a lot. It's interesting because I was talking with Adele, and I don't know if you know her, Adele Diamond. She's not a tall person. She's a short person, but she was telling me that in elementary school she was the tallest person. She grew to her height early in life, and she always thinks of herself as the tallest person in the room, which she's not. So there is something about this perception of your abilities. So kind of relating to this of if you know you have better working memory or you're just really better at inhibition, do you perform differently? And how that protects, for example, against, if you have better language development, does that provide any protective effect around sustaining your attention to language? So I don't really know kind of a really good way of measuring, because some of these things happen earlier, like diagnosis of ADHD and autism and dyslexia, around this sensitive period that we're doing. But I'm really curious to look at other people's data, if they have longitudinal data, and see if there is this significant change around age 6 to 8. I mean, it seems that from everything that Virginia and her group, they have published, at least in terms of musical skills, there seems to be something. There seems to be changes both in the auditory and motor areas, and kind of melodic perception and rhythm perception that is most pronounced in this time window. But I don't have really a good way of in what clinical population this can serve as a way of protection. But open to ideas.
I think we'll go to an online question.
Frank. Oh. Okay, go first.
So Christina der Nederlanden from online says, first, your results and the breadth of these studies is so inspiring. Can you talk about some of the factors that are related to students dropping out of these music interventions? I'm especially curious about, for instance, your most recent NIH study, which is a 2-year commitment.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I mean, both personal and societal factors. As for the population we're studying, one of the things that keep coming up is socioeconomic status of the parents and we have parents who they have to pick up another job. And we have to find, we've been doing a lot of this, of finding carpool with the other parents and finding ways for them to, because they just do not have the time to take their kids to the program. I think we had 1 or 2 children who just did not want to do this. And they're like, no, we don't want to be part of a theater. It's very intimidating. They were very shy. But mostly I'd say it comes from the parents' availability and their kind of like having the resources to be present. I mean, it's an intense commitment. It's an afternoon at 3 o'clock in the LA traffic that they have to make it to program 3 times a week. We have tried to recruit from the distances around programs, so it's not a huge commitment. But I mean, we have parents who take like 3 or 4 buses to make it to the program. So I think those are really the factors. It does change after they arrive at middle school age. Then they have a lot of more decision making around that. And I think with our longitudinal data, we saw dropouts that were related to the students themselves who like did not want to do this anymore. But at least at the younger age, I think it's and I mean, we just had the government shut down in LA and some of these in the United States, and some of these parents really do rely on Medicaid and SNAP benefits, and parents have told us that we can't come to programming because we need to take on another job to be able to, like, it's really these sad and huge factors that play. We do our best to provide anything that we can as long as we're not affecting programming differently, so all the kids get help with transportation and kind of being paired with other families. But again, I think the larger societal impact is at least in this age. Frank.
Yeah, I'll just echo, thanks for a wonderful, comprehensive talk. I didn't fully appreciate the breadth of this work. With the El Sistema work, I noticed that there were considerable sample size drops. So this is another question similar to Christina's, I suppose. I might have missed it, but how do you handle this? Like, how can you be assured, for example, that the differences in interhemispheric fiber tracts or the reduced cortical thinning don't depend on some level on this being a subsample of children that are willing and able to persist? So maybe right off the top, what were the differences across the groups? I could see participating in music being harder year after year than participating in sports, but I might be wrong.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and I think I completely agree, and I think I've heard many people, including Glenn Schellenberg, mentioning this, that is like some of these effects are like the kids who are stick with the program, like they like it, and you are really measuring participants who are motivated and engaged and practicing. So we started with 75 children, and up to your age, like 3 to 4 years in the study, we're still around like 60 numbers, and it's like about 15 across the 3 groups that we have lost. And it was pretty equal. It was not that one program more than that, especially between sports. What we actually lose is control kids because we are not as involved with them as much, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to do an RCT with like an active comparison. But yeah, I think that's a very valid point. And I mean, it could also be that when we have like the earlier results are like everybody's in the study, and then we see some fading of the results because we have dropout in the sample size. Our way of really answering that has been the RCT and seeing how we do a lot of work to keep these kids in the program. It's, I mean, I don't do it, my research staff and students do it, but whatever we can solve in terms of their access to the program, I don't know if beyond 2 years an RCT is feasible, because even with this is hard. But I think once it's completely possible that you're measuring individuals who are motivated, practice more, they're better musically, so they're more motivated to do. At least in the El Sistema, they're not very good musically, not even after 2 years. I mean, they all play violins, and it's sometimes at the beginning really unbearable to listen, but it's a lot of community. And I think that's, again, probably the success of El Sistema as a program worldwide, that they stick with it because it's a place to belong to.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Hi. Thank you for an amazing talk. I'm curious about your studies taking place and the children in your samples, like being from Los Angeles, which at least like to me, like as a non-local, is like very much associated with like movies and like a rich arts culture scene in general. And I'm curious if, and maybe I missed this, if musical engagement frequencies in the children's homes may be like higher than average compared to like other like huge cities in the US, or like higher than across the board. And maybe the second part to my question is, do you think if the same interventions were conducted in areas where arts are not as prominent as part of like the children's like everyday environment, whether you think there might be differences or even greater advantages perhaps in their executive function development at that young age?
Well, that's a very good question. Thank you. I think in terms of, so two things. One is the population, even though this is LA and Hollywood and the music scene, the population we work with did not necessarily have access, or maybe not even, they were not a part of a population who would go to concerts and performances. And that changed a little bit with the arrival and the work that Gustavo Dudamel did in LA, which I think the most, beyond Yola, his most significant contribution was that the scene at the Walt Disney Concert Hall changed. Like, there were parents of these kids who went to the Hollywood Bowl or the Disney Hall, and we went from a kind of a very homogenous population who would typically go to this to other, to kind of a more broader and diverse. So I think maybe as a result of his presence that has changed, but I wouldn't say these are not families of what you think typically of LA and kind of being engaged in the music industry. And even when we were working with the cross-sectional cohort, it was harder to find monolingual children than children who have no music at home. The other thing is that one of the things that my colleague Beatrice Ilari had a conversation with them at kind of like midway through programming, maybe the first year, about 6 months in, was that they, even though the program was El Sistema, but they were teaching them a lot of like the Western classical repertoire, and our feedback to them was that if you just keep teaching that, they're not gonna participate as a family. Like if the grandparent doesn't know the song, the child is not gonna sing at home, the family is not going to participate, and that probably will bring down level of engagement and participation and even retention in the program. So what they did is that they did include, they really made an effort to change their curriculum to be culturally sensitive and include music of the cultures that were represented. That being said, we haven't not systematically compared their home environment of music in other cities, but that's a really interesting point.
In regards to the executive function data, and you were talking about how there's this early effect that seems to either hit a ceiling or go away. I'm wondering, and you were talking about potential protective effects, do the kids get a report on how they do on those tests? Do they get feedback, or are they aware that they're doing well on those tests? Or do you just collect the data and they don't get any feedback on how they're doing with the score?
We don't give individual feedbacks, but once a year we bring each group in individually and we give them an update about how the parents, how they're doing. We don't like necessarily say your kids are doing really better in executive function, but we do have kind of like a report back to the families as like what was the result of your participation, how things look like, but no kind of individual feedback to encourage them to do better. I think it's maybe a more internal understanding. We also haven't been able to find a way to look at their academic achievement, because that could be a nice metric, but they go to different schools, and the quality of education is different at different schools and different teachers. So we don't have a standardized measure to relate to whether, if they're doing executive function better, are they also doing better at school and getting grades.
Okay. What about, do you do any measures of sort of their self-esteem or other kind of self-view of themselves that might be impacted if they feel like, oh, I'm doing really well at music, or I'm doing really well at theatre? Because, this kind of precocious development, often that is beneficial. Good self-esteem is good and helps you be resilient. Sometimes, like your example of your colleague who was tall at a young age and not now, sometimes it's actually negative that kids feel like, oh, I'm special, and then when other kids catch up with them, they feel disappointed that, oh, I'm not special anymore, and it can be bad for their self-esteem in the long run. So I wonder if you're
That's a
those
really
factors.
interesting point. We currently do not have a self-esteem measure. We do have a belonging measure in terms of like how much they feel belong to their community and how they relate to their friends in the RCT, but nothing like individual self-esteem. But that's actually a really good point. Yeah, I agree. I think Miriam.
Just to echo, we're all going from the not loud, too loud.
I can repeat it if you just say it loud.
I have no problem being loud, okay. The visually. Yeah, okay. So just to echo, like, what a phenomenal body of work, and sort of blown away by how much work and, of course, the quality of it as well. I was curious, I had kind of two related questions kind of going off of Frank's question with the longitudinal study. I don't know if you have, it's so amazing that you have not many dropouts for the first 5 years. I wonder at that 7-year time point, when you have the sort of adolescent volition, if there's enough of those kids who have dropped out, that could be almost like
A control.
a later motivation, like that then you could reanalyze the earlier data based on kids who do or don't. I don't know if the sample is big enough.
Yeah, no, very good. So the question was, if I can repeat it for everyone, if whether the sample of dropout between year 5 and 7, so we went from like 75 to about 35, is large enough that they can kind of be their own control, like kids who have done this many years of training and drop out. We haven't been really successful in trying to bring them back, although we are planning. This is the year they're like finishing high school, going to college, some of them. So we had 2 cohorts. One of them started earlier. One idea is for them to come back at this upcoming summer, and we can kind of like the ones who dropped out and the ones who were like continued in the program to see what's going on, whether this like even part of this music training had any impact in the trajectory of their life and decisions they made. We lost enough of the families who moved out of LA during COVID. So that sample who's not there, I mean, we can try to find them and do like Zoom testing, but we haven't, it was easier to keep in touch with them prior to the pandemic. And but no, that's a really good point. For the RCT, we do have, we are collecting contacts from like family members and neighbors and friends. So for the ones who do drop out, we can kind of find a way to test them, even though maybe they did 1 year of training or they signed up and right after randomization they don't. So we are trying to do a control group. I also didn't mention that for the RCT, we do have a control group of passive. It's not part of my grant, so I don't talk about it as much, but it's not a randomized control group, but just for us to see effective development over time. We do have a group of 6-year-olds who we recruit them, test them, and again, 2 years. But again, because we are not as much in touch with them, they're a harder group to kind of keep track of. No.
Hang on,
Oh, yeah.
now it's working. Okay. So I'm really intrigued by the sort of in-between status of your sports activity group. Because in many ways, you'd think it would offer the same advantages of the musical training group. It's an organized activity. They have a peer group. They have adult supervision and adult contact. So it leads me to sort of a two-part or two aspects of the question, which is, what were your actual expectations for the sports activity group? Would this lead them to performance close to the level of the music group? And if not, then what is it that was special about the music training that wasn't there in the sports training, and what other domains would you expect to find that in?
Yeah, a very good question. Thank you. We added the sports group because our kind of like thought going into it was that anything that is auditory and language and music related probably will be best in the music group. So we see changes in those domains. This is a system that is being stimulated, and everything else, cognitive, social, emotional, maybe the sports group would do as well. Social, emotional, they did as well. And in some of there are like gross motor movement measures, they do as well. There are no differences. In the executive function, especially in inhibition, they are doing better than the control participants, but not as well as the music group. So that, I didn't really expect that to happen. I think I've been thinking a lot about both in terms of like response inhibition is something that you continuously do when you learn to play an instrument, especially as you get better. This kind of like knowing when to stop, paying attention to the auditory environment. And then this delayed gratification of like having to, I mean, for any of you who's a musician, you know, you're a kid, you want to go play out, and then you have to like practice for 45 minutes before you go to school, and then you come back. So it's kind of regimen, although if you get kind of like more competitive sports, maybe that's the case as well. This was a more community soccer program, so it did not have all those structure. So that was like one of the reasons we chose theater and drama as a comparison group, because I think especially with that, we will see changes in perspective taking and social behavior that is going to be more pronounced in the theater group. And again, things that are related to the auditory environment, attention in the auditory environment, working memory that relies on auditory domain, auditory motor integration. Our expectation is that we'd see, and then this question of inhibition that was not so resolved with the sports music comparison. We're hoping to really address it here.
I have another.
Time for about one more question.
Okay. This one will probably be short. This is from Adam Luoma, who's an online audience member. Inside the large cohort, were children with physical or developmental disabilities included? And if so, were outcomes similar to typically developing kids?
Yeah, a good question. No, we excluded everybody with, and then in the RCT, we are excluding children with autism, dyslexia, and ADHD.
Okay, that was really quick, so we have time for one more.
Okay. Yeah.
And I was wondering what's your position because of your expertise, and also what is the position like in America? Like if that's a debate that's also been going on here, or if it's just isolated. Because yesterday we saw the case of the two musicians on the stage that they started studying at the age of 2, and I'm aware that this is much more of an Asian approach to musical training, and in Europe it's not the case. And on top of that, we have fewer and fewer like mandatory hours. This is a bit preoccupying.
Yeah. No, a very good question. I mean, I cannot speak for the whole United States because it's so different. I can speak for California and Los Angeles. Many of our public schools do not have music and arts program. We recently actually passed, a couple years ago, a proposition, it's called Prop 28, that mandated music and arts training for every child in every public school. It's a great proposition. The problem is that we now have the money in schools, but we don't have music educators. Nobody thought about the next step of who is going to teach all these kids. So it's a little haphazard the way it's being rolled out. Some principals have bought like 10 keyboards and they call that the music class. Some have, so there has to be a lot of thinking because there is shortage of both educators and hours of music. As a scientist, I feel that, and I kind of hope that that becomes a little bit part of a graduate training, that we can communicate with educators and policymakers, not to like convince, but to have a way of providing results and findings. I mean, I especially feel responsible for this. Our studies are federally funded. This is really tax dollars of citizens who are providing the support of this. And I have been working with, at least in California, with writing, and it's a really different approach. It's kind of not as nuanced when you talk, because they just want a one-page brief of, okay, what happened? So what changed? What is good? What is bad? So, and kind of learning how to think in that way a little bit. But it's been fulfilling to communicate the results and provide evidence. It's similar to research. Things don't change over time. But at least for us, even the fact that YOLA as a program has expanded and served some of these, we do a lot of effort in communicating with the Los Angeles Philharmonic Board and people who can support financially programs like this to show some of these benefits, so at least more children get this training.
Great, that's a nice place to end. I will remind you there's probably more questions. We have an open Q&A at the very end of the conference, so we can come back to these issues and talk to the whole, all of the people. This Discord, you can also put your questions on Discord if you'd like, and we'll come back to those. So now we've got the poster blitz. So, before that, let's thank Assal.